There's a hush. Aslan is afoot. Something is stirring. Well, welcome. It's great to see each of you here. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Michael Ward, one of the world's foremost experts on the work and life of C.S. Lewis. Dr. Ward is a member of the theology faculty at the University of Oxford and a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. In fact, one of our recent graduates, John Southards, recently was a student in one of Dr. Ward's classes at HBU. Dr. Ward studied English at Oxford, theology at Cambridge, and has a PhD in divinity from St. Andrews. From 1996 to 1999, Dr. Ward was resident warden of the Kilns, Lewis's Oxford home. On the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death in 2013, Professor Ward unveiled a permanent national memorial to Lewis in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. He's the co-editor of a volume of commemorative essays marking the anniversary entitled C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner. Dr. Ward is the author of the award-winning book, Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, which is the topic of tonight's lecture. The title of the lecture specifically is The Heavens Are Declaring the Glory of God, C.S. Lewis, Narnia, and the Planets. If you listen carefully, this will forever change the way you think about Narnia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Ward.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everybody. I'm very glad to be with you at Patrick Henry. This is my first visit here. I've heard a lot about you over the years from my friends at Hillsdale. I've just come to you from Hillsdale, and I hope, although this is my first visit, it won't be the last. We shall see. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Those are the opening verses of Psalm 19. I am sure you recognize them. C.S. Lewis described Psalm 19 as the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. And it's about C.S. Lewis's interest in the heavens and how the heavens tell the glory of God that I want to speak to you tonight. I'm going to speak for an hour, and then we'll have Q&A up until 8:30. I want to talk to you in particular about C.S. Lewis's best-known works, the 7 Chronicles of Narnia, and how I believe they are structured out of the imagery of the 7 heavens. The 7 heavens of the medieval cosmos, which Lewis, being a medievalist, knew a great deal about. But why should the Narnia Chronicles be keyed to anything? Why should they have any sort of substructure or guiding pattern at all? Aren't they intelligible enough in their own terms? Well, that's a very good question to ask, because when C.S. Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to his great friend J.R.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien hated what he was hearing, or at any rate, he was not strangely warmed, as if he were John Wesley. He thought that Lewis had assembled that first story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, out of very incompatible mythological traditions. English children centaurs and fauns and dryads and naiads out of Greek and Roman mythology, a white witch character fresh from the pages of a Hans Andersen fairy tale. Father Christmas, for goodness sake, what's he doing in this story? And Tolkien thought they didn't belong in a single story. And because Tolkien has gone on to be so famous, his rather chary attitude to Narnia has also become well known, and lots of people have assumed that Tolkien was more familiar with the books than he actually was, and they've sort of followed in his train and said, yeah, Narnia was just, slopped together out of any old thing that Lewis happened to catch his eye. The only problem with that is, of course, that Lewis was not characteristically a random or a slapdash writer or thinker. He was a very rigorous and consistent thinker and had very good reasons for everything that he wrote. And so people have said, well, okay, Tolkien is right on the surface. The stories do seem to be assembled out of very disparate mythological traditions, but surely there's some sort of inner meaning that ties the books together a bit more obviously. And the place that everybody has immediately looked, of course, is the biblical parallels in the series, which Lewis wrote about a certain amount. He once said that the whole Narnia series is about Christ. The whole Narnia series is about Christ. And when we look at the Narnia Chronicles, we find that Aslan, the Christ character, is the only character who appears in all 7 books. And he is indeed very Christ-like, especially in these 3 stories. Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he is the Narnian redeemer, dying and rising for the sake of a sinner. In The Magician's Nephew, Aslan is the creator, singing Narnia into being. And in the last battle, Aslan is the Narnian judge. He brings Narnia to an end in the Narnian equivalent of the Apocalypse and the Book of Revelation. All well and good. But these are only 3 out of 7 books. This is less than half the series. What's going on in the other 4? Aslan is still present in these stories, and he's still Christ-like in various ways. He's the moral center of each tale. But there's no obvious biblical episode or part of Christ's life or ministry that C.S. Lewis seems to be reimagining in these 4 books. Given what he's done in the first 3 I talked about, you might have expected that these 4 would again reimagine major elements of Christ's life or ministry. So a whole Narnia series maybe about, I don't know, the ascension of Aslan, or an equivalent of the day of Pentecost when Christ's Spirit is sent on the church. But you don't get that. What do you get? In Prince Caspian, you have Aslan entering the story amongst dancing trees before giving a great war cry. In The Dawn Treader, Aslan is seen flying in a sunbeam as a bird. In The Silver Chair, Aslan doesn't actually come down to Narnia at all. He's confined to his own high country above the clouds, which seems to be more like an Old Testament understanding of the divine nature. Not incarnate into the sub-created world, but still up in a kind of heaven. So how is that Christian? And in the Horse and His Boy, Aslan is mistaken for 2 lions, or possibly 3 lions, and he does a great deal of dashing about in that story. You remember he says there was only 1 lion, but he was swift of foot. So why has Lewis decided to depict his Christ character as swift of foot in that particular story? I don't recall Jesus in the New Testament being a notable sprinter, or having a special ministry to athletes. So why would you make that imaginative choice? These are questions which don't really occur to us as we just enjoy the stories, but if you stand back and ask yourself, the whole Narnia series is about Christ. Well, how is it about Christ? And that's the question I'm going to try and answer tonight with reference to the 7 heavens, because the 7 heavens are telling the glory of God. And that's what my book, Planet Narnia, is about. It's available at a very reasonable price from the bookshop, and I think I've signed half of you your books already, so thank you for your interest in this work. C.S. Lewis, why would he secretly key his Narnia books to the seven heavens? If my theory is right, and I admit it's quite a bold claim that I'm making, that he had a secret imaginative substructure to the Narnia books which he told nobody about, not even close friends like Tolkien, and then after several decades I come along and find out. I mean, how arrogant do I think I am? It's a preposterously large claim, and believe me, when I stumbled across this, when I was halfway through my PhD researches, I felt almost literally concussed. I felt like someone had taken a 2x4 to my brain, because I already knew these books very well. I'd been reading them for about 30 years, and then suddenly this whole extra dimension of complexity and beauty and sophistication unveiled itself in front of me, and I thought, wow, these books are even better than I thought. These books are about Christ in an even deeper, more biblical way than I had previously assumed. Lewis could be secretive. Jack never ceased to be secretive is the verdict of his friend George Sayer, who knew him for 30 years and wrote a biography about him. And I'm sure you know that Jack was his nickname. He was Clive Staples Lewis, but he hated the name Clive and detested the name Staples, as he would. So he was always known as Jack. And George Sayer said, Jack never ceased to be secretive. If we're looking for examples of C.S. Lewis's secretiveness, the most obvious is the fact that when he got married in his late 50s, he kept his marriage secret for the best part of a year, even from close friends like Tolkien. That is an extraordinary thing to do. The whole point of a marriage is that it is a public relationship. Lewis kept his marriage secret. His autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many important things that one of his other friends said that it really should have been entitled not Surprised by Joy, but Suppressed by Jack. This is a man who could be very guarded, very compartmentalized, very private, and indeed sometimes very secretive when he thought he had good reason for being so. So keep that in mind as I try to unpack this literary secret within the Narnia Chronicles. Let me give you a few background reasons as to why Lewis might have done this, even before I try to show that he did this. I've already said that the Narnia series is about Christ, but when you hear that, what do you immediately think? You probably think, well, Aslan dies and rises for Edmund. That's like a biblical parallel or allegory. And that's true. I'm not saying anything against that. That, of course, is part of what it means. But consider this verse from the letter to the Colossians. Lewis was interested in this verse. He paraphrased it in one of his books. Rather than just saying, for all things were created through Christ and for Christ, and in Christ all things hold together, Lewis paraphrased it as, Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together. We should not just think of Jesus Christ incarnate, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of Man, Emmanuel, God with us. We should not just think of that aspect of Christology. We should also think of this more cosmic dimension, because Christ is the Word of God, and the Word has brought all things into being and is sustaining all things in being. We can think of Christ in two ways at once, as the Word which holds the universe together, and the Word made flesh, who dwells among us. The problem, though, with trying to understand the cosmic Christ is that we have no negative with which to contrast our positive awareness of this thing. I mean, with Jesus, when he comes among us, we can distinguish him from all the other people amongst whom he stands. But we can't compare this universe in its totality with any other universe, because we don't know any other universe. Lewis says this: the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, namely God, the Christian God, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be precisely the one that's most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious, and that is exactly how the supernatural has been forgotten. What Lewis is trying to say here is that just as fish don't know that the water is wet, we don't know with our contemplative consciousness that our universe is drenched, saturated with this all-pervasive principle of cohesion, namely Christ, who is holding everything together. Because we can't step outside it and look back at it and get an angle on it. We're inside it. We're like fish in the sea. And therefore it can escape our awareness. It's effectively hidden from us because it is everywhere. The whole Narnia series is about Christ. But how would Lewis go about depicting this aspect of Christology in his stories? Because it would have to be in every part of the story, but nowhere standing out. It would have to be woven into the warp and the woof of the text. So keep that question in mind as we progress. That's a theological background point that's worth having in mind. And now a more literary background point. The kappa element in romance is the title of an essay Lewis wrote, and kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, which means cryptic or hidden. And romance here means story. So Lewis wrote an essay called The Hidden Element in Story. Lewis wrote an essay called The Hidden Element in Story. This should alert us to the possibility that there may be more going on in Narnia than meets the eye. The only problem is that most people don't know about this essay because it only exists in note form and was never published under this title. Lewis later wrote up those notes and published them under a different title, On Stories, where he says this: to be stories at all, stories must be series of events, but it must be understood that this series, the plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or a quality. Now, this state or quality of a well-told tale, this flavor or atmosphere or tone, is the cryptic element, the hidden element in a story. Why? Because it is in every part of the story. A well-told tale doesn't just give you a sequence of events, a clever plot. It also gives you a believable three-dimensional world which you gain access to imaginatively. I mean, there are stories, aren't there, which are mostly plot and not much character or atmosphere, like, your typical sort of Agatha Christie whodunit, where the plot is the main thing. You just want to work out who did the murder, but you don't often go back to Agatha Christie just for the sake of living in the Agatha Christie world. There's not much going on in the Agatha Christie world apart from solving the mystery. But with a great novelist like, say, Jane Austen, you'll go back to her novels over and over again. You'll reread Pride and Prejudice many times in the course of your life, not because you have forgotten that Elizabeth Bennet marries Mr. Darcy. Sorry if that's a spoiler for anybody. You go back and reread Pride and Prejudice because you like the Austen world. You like what might be called the ostentatious flavor of her world. Thank you. And that's because Jane Austen gives you a believable three-dimensional reality that you just like being in. You like breathing in that imaginative oxygen. But try to point on the page to a particular thing that produces the Austen flavor, and you'll be hard-pressed because it's not identifiable with any particular thing. It's in the whole world and every part of it. Therefore, it's effectively hidden from you while you read, When you close the book and reflect upon it afterwards, you can think, oh yeah, I can name certain qualities about the Austen world. But while you're living it, while you're in the story, you can't notice it. Because again, you're inside it like a fish is in the sea. It's effectively hidden from you because it's the oxygen that you breathe. So that's the hidden element in story, the kappa element in romance. And now one last background point which we need to have in mind before we try to demonstrate this planetary reading of Narnia is this. Transferred classicism. This is a term that Lewis coined when he was writing a review of the Oxford Book of Christian Verse. And he's talking about how Christian writers, as late as the 17th century, often reach back into the classical past, and they find in classical mythology any number of gods and goddesses and images and tropes, and they transfer those classical mythological elements into their Christian poetry, their Christian drama, and by means of doing that, they say something about Christianity. God, the Christian God, Lewis says, will often appear in medieval literature, but masked, dressed up as Apollo or Venus or Jupiter or Zeus or whoever it may be. This is a way of exploiting pagan mythology for Christian purposes. It's sort of baptized paganism, to use a term Lewis was fond of. And what he's describing here has a sort of biblical precedent in what we see St. Paul doing in the book of Acts, when Paul goes to Athens and preaches to the Athenians, quoting their own poems, their own poets. He says, doesn't he? God is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. And he's quoting here Aratus and Epimenides, two Greek poets who wrote poems about Zeus. In Zeus we live and move and have our being, for we are indeed Zeus's offspring, is what Paul is quoting here. And he's using it as a kind of springboard into his presentation of the gospel. Of course, Paul is not recommending that the Athenians worship Zeus, but he's saying to the Athenians, your knowledge of God is not entirely wrong. You know that we're God's offspring. You know that we live and move and have our being in God, but you're wrong in calling him Zeus. The God I proclaim to you, Paul says, is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. But you see how he uses classical knowledge of divine matters as a way of presenting the gospel. It's a sort of early version of the transferred classicism that Lewis identifies as a purely literary technique many centuries later. Okay, so those are our background points. Lewis could be secretive. When he says that the whole Narnia series is about Christ, we should think cosmically as well as incarnationally. He had a belief in the kappa, or hidden element in a story, effectively hidden from you while you read because you're inside it, that atmosphere or flavor. And finally, he believed that that Christian themes could be masked behind a pagan veil. Right, we're making progress. How are the Narnia books structured out of the seven heavens? Well, at this point we should remind ourselves that although Lewis is best known for Narnia and indeed his Christian apologetics, like Mere Christianity, he wasn't professionally either a writer of fiction, nor was he professionally a Christian apologist. Professionally, of course, he was an academic. And he taught at Oxford for 30 years, finished his career at Cambridge, and the biggest book he ever wrote was this, English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. The snappiest title you could come up with. And it was part of this multi-volume series by different authors called the Oxford History of English Literature, or Oh Hell, as Lewis called it. It took him 15 years to write this book. And if ever you read it, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already, you'll find that it opens with a long discussion of the new astronomy that came in the 16th century in the wake of the theories of Nicholas Copernicus, because slap bang in the middle of the 16th century, Copernicus theorized that we live in a heliocentric, not a geocentric cosmos. Copernicus effectively relocated Earth. We had thought we were central. He argues that we're peripheral. We're on the circumference. We go around the sun does not go around us, as everyone had previously believed. So Copernicus is kind of a big deal. And Lewis certainly thought so. And that's why in his last academic book, The Discarded Image, he 3 times invites his readers to take a walk under the sky at night, imagining themselves back into the pre-Copernican mindset. Imagine that you still believed, he says to his readers, that the Earth was at the center of everything, that it was static and central and surrounded by not space, but the heavens that tell the glory of God. Let us just remind ourselves of these 7 heavens. They were, first of all, the heaven of the moon, then that of Mercury and Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. These are the 7 heavens. These are the 7 planets, each planet with its own attributes that it would shed upon the Earth, influencing people and events and even the metals in Earth's crust. And here's a slightly more detailed diagram of that old cosmological arrangement as it was believed to be. And the best way, really, to remember the 7 heavens, because, of course, you will have noticed that there's no Neptune, there's no Uranus, there's no Pluto. Those hadn't been discovered yet. These are the planets that can be seen with the naked eye. The best way to remember the 7 is by reference to the names of the days of the week. It's obvious how Saturday is Saturn Day, Sunday, Sunday, Monday, Moon Day. The other 4 days of the week are slightly hidden from us in English because we use the Anglo-Saxon versions of the Norse gods and goddesses. But if you think in Spanish, think Thor, Thursday. Thor is the equivalent of the Roman Jove, Jueves. Jove is Jupiter. Tu is Mars, Martes. Freya is Venus, Vienes. Woden is the equivalent of Mercury, Miércoles, and so on. So we're referring to these 7 heavens every day of our lives, though we have largely forgotten it. Lewis hadn't forgotten it because it was his job as a medieval scholar to keep alive in his readers' and his students' minds an awareness of this old cosmological system. Why? Because it was everywhere presupposed in medieval literature. You can't read Dante without becoming aware of the 7 heavens. I mean, the Paradiso, the pilgrim mounts up through the 7 heavens, doesn't he, in his ascent to God's throne. And this is an illustration from an edition of the Divine Comedy, showing you the 7 planetary characters in the order of the days of the week. So on the left you have, in his burning fiery chariot, Apollo, the sun god, come across to the moon in her silvery gown, holding the crescent for Monday. Then Mars for Tuesday in his helmet and his chain mail, Mars, the god of war. Then Mercury. You can tell he's Mercury because he's got wings on his heels. Mercury is swift of foot. Then Thor, or Jupiter, for Thursday, and you know he's Jupiter because of that rod over his shoulder. That's a scepter, because Jupiter was associated with all things kingly and monarchical. Venus in her green gown for Friday, Vienes, Venus associated with fertility, creativity, love and laughter. And finally Saturn for Saturday, holding his scythe or his sickle, because Saturn was associated with death and disaster. Think of Old Father Time. Old Father Time is based on earlier pictures of Saturn, Lewis says in The Discarded Image. Another medieval writer to use the planets all over his work was Chaucer, and here's a page of notes that I found in C.S. Lewis's handwriting. This is from the end leaves of Lewis's complete Chaucer, and we don't have time to describe this column of figures on the left, but You can just make out, I hope, at the top, planetary hours, the Knight's Tale. The Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. Lewis admired the way that Chaucer used the planets in that poem. He didn't just put them as actors into the storyline, but he wove the appropriate influences into the plot so that the climax of the Knight's Tale, for instance, happens on a Tuesday, on Martyrs. How appropriate for a story about knights. So Lewis has this deep, scholarly, academic understanding of how the planets have been used in literature in medieval and Renaissance times. But he also responded to the heavens more personally. We've already seen how he admired Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God, but he also knew his stars and his planets quite well from the point of view of an amateur astronomer. He had a telescope on the balcony of his bedroom. He would often point out unusual conjunctions of the planets in the night sky. He enjoyed a trip to the local observatory. He was quite a keen amateur astronomer. But he also used these planets and these celestial traditions in his fiction. He wrote 3 volumes of interplanetary adventure called the Cosmic Trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy, some people call it the Space Trilogy. This is the first book, set on Mars. The second book is set on Venus, and in the third book, some of the planetary intelligences come down to Earth. They exert their influences very palpably, bringing about the denouement of the whole trilogy. Why was Lewis so interested? He said this: the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter? Now this is an absolutely crucial quotation for the whole argument that I'm making about Narnia, because this shows us that Lewis regarded the planets as not just some medieval curiosity fit for superstitious pre-scientific minds. No, he's saying they have a permanent value in the human imagination. They can symbolize spiritual qualities for us. And indeed, they are especially valuable in our own generation, he says. Lewis's generation was the generation that went through the First World War. And that's why he says, of Saturn, we know more than enough. Saturn, with his sickle, cutting people down, was all too familiar a figure for Lewis's contemporaries. 750,000 British servicemen were killed in the Great War. Lewis himself was very nearly one of them. He fought in the trenches of France and was very nearly killed, had a sort of out-of-body experience when he was hit by a shell which spat at him full of shrapnel, bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life. And as a result of the First World War, a lot of the culture of the 1920s and 30s became very bleak, very cynical, very disillusioned. A not unnatural response to the huge trauma of the First World War. But Lewis thought that although Saturn had his uses, symbolically speaking, for representing the bleaker aspects of human experience, Saturn was not the only way of perceiving reality, nor was he the best way, because the best of the 7 heavens was Jupiter, the king. Who does not need to be reminded of Jove? When Lewis came to write the Narnia books, I believe he took these 7 spiritual symbols and used them, 1 per chronicle, as his imaginative blueprint, as the key to the kappa element of each story. We don't have time to go in detail through all 7, but let's just spend some time going through the first 3, and then I'll just quickly summarize the remaining 4. And that means we start with Jupiter. Who does not need to be reminded of Jupiter? Here's the planet, and in the... do I have a... Yes, I think I do. There you see it. In the southeast corner of Jupiter there, you can just make out, I hope, the great red spot, the great eye of Jupiter, That's a storm perpetually raging on the surface of Jupiter. We'll come back to that in a minute. And here is Jupiter, the king of the gods. Jupiter in Roman, Zeus in Greek, Thor in Norse mythology. He is the king. Now, halfway through my PhD researches, I was reading one night in bed. I was reading Lewis's long poem called The Planets, where he gives a poetic expression of these various spiritual symbols. It's not just in his academic works, it's not just in the trilogy, but it's also in his poetry that you find him exploring these symbols. And I came across these lines describing Jupiter: of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven and good fortune, Jove is master. And I did a double take, especially with regard to those 5 words, winter past and guilt forgiven. Winter past and guilt forgiven, I said to myself. Come across that in another of Lewis's works. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is all about the passing of winter and the forgiving of guilt. You remember how in that first Narnia chronicle, the White Witch has made it always winter but never Christmas. And Edmund's guilt, Edmund, who has betrayed his brother and sisters, his guilt is forgiven as Aslan dies in his stead. I said to myself, is this the Kappa element? Is this a key to the Kappa element? And I began to look more closely at the jovial symbolism as Lewis wrote about it in various places. Kingship is the key quality of Jupiter. But we must think of a king at peace, enthroned, taking his leisure, serene, tranquil, festive, magnanimous. That's the kind of kingship that Jupiter represents, Lewis says. So think of Aslan in that first Narnia chronicle. When the children first get into Narnia, they don't know who Aslan is. By the way, you must read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, not The Magician's Nephew. If ever you see a series of Narnia chronicles with Magician's Nephew numbered 1 on the spine, rip off the spine and throw it away. It's deeply misleading to read The Magician's Nephew first. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first story. And the children don't know who Aslan is. They think he might just be a regular man, but they're told, no, he's the king. That's the very first description given of him. He's the king of the wood. He's the king of the beasts. He's not safe, but he's good. He is the king. And we're later shown that he's got a royal standard, a royal pavilion, all these royal accoutrements. And the children, of course, themselves become kings and queens as the story progresses. I mean, that's figured right from the start when they go into the wardrobe, isn't it? And they put on the fur coats, and we're told they looked more like royal robes than coats when they put them on. And that's an indication of where the story is going to eventuate when they are crowned and hailed and sceptered and enthroned in the castle at the end of the tale. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. Once a queen in Narnia, always a queen in Narnia. The children themselves become kingly. But there's a hitch on the way, of course, Edmund's treachery. And how is Edmund's treachery atoned for? Through the death of Aslan on the stone table. A very obvious reworking of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. What does that have to do with Jupiter? Why bring in Jupiter at all? Well, interestingly, in the same year that Lewis began writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he published another book on the poetry of his friend Charles Williams. And in that book, Lewis says this: when he writes of Jupiter's red-pierced planet, Charles Williams assumes that the huge reddish spot which astronomers observe on the surface of Jupiter is a wound, and the redness is that of blood. Jupiter, the planet of kingship, thus wounded, becomes another archetype, another reflection, another symbol of the divine king wounded on Calvary. So we see here that Lewis very explicitly connects the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, the divine king on Calvary, with the bleeding planet of Jupiter. The jovial symbolism allows him to talk about not just Christ's kingship, but Christ's sacrifice too. Everywhere we look in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we find it infused with these jovial elements. Look at this woodcut, this medieval woodcut, showing you Jupiter enthroned in the heavens, and down on earth are the people who exhibit jovial influences. So there in the foreground on the right, you can see a man kneeling for coronation. He's just about to be crowned. And in the middle ground on the left, you can see another figure kneeling before a judge. Is his guilt going to be forgiven or not? And in the background, you can just make out, I hope, horses and hounds just there, hunting a white stag, the white hart that kings and queens would hunt for in medieval romances. And if you think of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you may remember that the final chapter is entitled The Hunting of the White Stag. Interesting. But far too clever, far too complicated. It all just arose unbidden to Lewis's mind, didn't it? Because he was so steeped in all this imagery that it wasn't intentional, it was accidental. Well, fair point. And for the sake of argument, let's say it was accidental. But when we turn to the second book, Prince Caspian, we find that this is strangely infused with martial symbolism. This is the Mars book because Mars is the god of war, and Prince Caspian is a war story. It's the civil war of Narnia, the great war of deliverance, as it's called. And if you saw the recent film version, which I hope you didn't, you'll remember how they really went to town on the battle scenes. Military symbolism and escapades are everywhere in this story. But you might say there are military scenes in most of the stories, and you'd be right. So what makes this peculiarly martial? Well, it's partly the kinds of battles and the kinds of military events that occur. These are military events that engender knighthood and discipline and order and chivalry. Whereas the battle in the final book, the last battle, is apocalyptic. It leads to darkness and coldness and death. So it's the kinds of military events that we need to consider, not just whether there are battles. These are martial, peculiarly martial battles, knightly battles. But what clinches it is another major theme of imagery running through Prince Caspian, which has to do not with war, but with woods. Trees, forests, they are everywhere in this book. And that's because Lewis is drawing upon the other major element of Roman mythology when it came to the god Mars, because Mars to the Romans was not always and only the god of war. He was originally a vegetation deity. He was associated with trees and forests, and he was known as Mars Silvanus. And look at this mural from Pompeii. It shows you Mars in both capacities at once. So he's got his spear, his helmet, his shield. He's obviously the military character, but he's standing against a backdrop of burgeoning vegetation. Think of the month of March. Why do we call March March? It's because Mars is the god of March. In that third month of the year, the weather is getting good enough for armies to march off to battle again, but also the trees are beginning to come back to life after winter. And that's why Prince Caspian is full of both war imagery and woodland imagery. And you see them here in a single image from Prince Caspian. The single combat in the foreground, and in the background you can just make out the trees, the dryads, the hamadryads, and the sylvans. Only in this book are the tree spirits called sylvans. Lewis is making a nod to Mars Silvanus from classical mythology. Aslan sums up the martial spirit in his own person, just as he had summed up the jovial spirit in his person in the first book. In the first book, he was kingly. Here, Aslan is the commander. He summons everyone to the battle. He gives the great war cry. But he's also the one in whose presence the trees come alive. Lucy, you remember, tries to wake the trees on her own, but fails. And then later, with Aslan present, She sees this lovely country dance of the trees moving in and out of each other. And even tiny little details help contribute to the overall martial atmosphere. So remember how, in the opening scene, the children discover a tiny little chess piece in the ruins of the castle. Now, this chess piece could have been a king, a queen, a pawn. It could have been unidentified, just a chess piece. But of course, it is a chess knight with a little red ruby eye. Because knighthood, chivalry, gallantry, all things martial are the inner meaning of this story. Just as Chaucer's Knight's Tale had to conclude on a Tuesday, so this chess piece had to be a knight. Everything is conspiring to generate the kappa element, the martial spirit of the tale. And Aslan sums it up in his own person. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, my favorite. This is the solar story, full of sunshine and gold and wisdom and dragons' hordes and so on and so forth. The ship itself is shaped like a dragon. You see on the front cover there, Caspian's tunic has a solar symbol on the chest. I wrote to Pauline Baines, the illustrator of the books. She was still alive when I was doing my PhD. Alas, she's now died. And I asked her if Lewis had ever told her about this planetary scheme, and she said no. But it's a testimony to Pauline Baines' skill as an illustrator that she picked up on this solar theme as she read the book so carefully and put it there on the front cover, even though Lewis never mentioned it to anybody. And that solar symbol on the tunic of Caspian is not, as if I remember rightly, it's not described in the book. She invented that. She picked up, she intuited that this book had solar qualities at its heart. But what does it have to do with dragons? I mean, dragons collect gold, yes, and gold is the sun's metal, but there's a deeper connection, because in Greek mythology, the god of light was Apollo, and Apollo was famously a slayer of dragons. If you know your Homer's hymn to Apollo features a famous episode where a dragon is slain by the god of light. And so in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, this is a still from the recent movie version, which I really hope you didn't see. It's even worse than Prince Caspian. Here you can just make out, so this is Eustace. He's been turned into a dragon, yeah, and he's just about to be undragoned by Aslan. You can just make out the approaching figure of the lion there, reflected in his eyeball. And he's going to rip off the thick, dark, knobbly hide and turn Eustace back into a boy again. And this is not just a convenient symbol of Christian conversion, being released from our sins, although of course it is that, but it's deliberately couched in solar terms because Sol is the inner meaning of this book. Everything is conspiring to generate a solar atmosphere. That is why Aslan is seen flying in a sunbeam. Lucy looked along the beam and she saw the Christ character. Aslan is seen scattering light from his mane at the eastern edge of the world. The whole journey is towards the rising sun. I am the light of the world, Jesus says in John's Gospel. It's interesting how all this imagery, this classical and medieval imagery, has roots in the Bible. I am the light of the world, for the sun. God is Lord of hosts, mighty in battle, for Mars. King of kings and Lord of lords, for Jupiter. And so on, 7 times over. It's all entirely compatible with, and in some ways rooted in, Scripture, what Lewis is doing. But he doesn't just start and stop with the Bible in a sort of woodenly allegorical way. He goes a long way round through classical mythology and medieval astrology, enriching his biblical theology as he goes, so that there's all sorts of resonances and layerings to this imagery. That's part of the secret to the success of the Narnia Chronicles. We sense there's so much going on, so many things being alluded to and referenced and connoted. Not because it's hodgepodge, although it may look like that ostensibly on the surface, but it's all keyed, it's all controlled by a logic which is based on one of the seven heavens. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Let's just quickly trot through the remaining books. The Silver Chair, of course, is the moon story, full of wetness and wanderings and lunacy. The Horse and His Boy is the Mercury story, full of running. Aslan is swift of foot in this book because he is the embodiment of Mercury. He is the embodiment of the Word of God, living and active. That's why Aslan is swift of foot. The Magician's Nephew is the Venus book because in this work Aslan brings Narnia into being. He creates it. There's a magic apple in a western garden. A mother's life is saved. Everything is pregnant and fertile and lovely. Here's Venus depicted in medieval times with her magic golden apple. And the last battle, of course, is the Saturnine story, because in this book, Narnia is brought to its end, and every character who is alive at the start of the tale is dead by the end of it. And who brings it to an end? But Father Time. He actually appears in the cast list. And remember how Lewis had said, our picture of Father Time with his scythe and his hourglass is based on earlier pictures of Saturn. The late Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's editor and biographer, kindly alerted me to the existence in the Bodleian Library at Oxford of a typescript of the Silver Chair. It's the only typescript of any of the Narnia Chronicles that has survived. And Hooper said to me, go and read that. You'll find it interesting. And I went and looked, and I found that in the draft of the Silver Chair, in the draft of the Silver Chair, where Father Time is shown sleeping in the underworld kingdom as a way of setting up his later appearance in the last battle, he's described not as Father Time, but as the god Saturn. It's there in the typescript. And in the last battle, Father Time wakes up, brings Narnia to an end, and ushers in the Narnian apocalypse. Now, if this theory is correct, why would C.S. Lewis have done it? I think there are three main reasons. One is simply fun. He was a playful man. I knew in Cambridge Simon Barrington Ward, who had been a colleague of Lewis's in Cambridge in the 1950s. And I went and had a chat with Simon Barrington Ward one day, and I told him about this discovery, and he said, yes, that's exactly like Jack. He would have loved that. He would have roared with laughter as he did all that. He thought it was entirely consistent with what he knew of Lewis's personality, just the playfulness, the fun. Because Lewis didn't have to do any laborious research. All this imagery was at his fingertips. He'd been steeping himself in it for decades. So that's one reason, which we shouldn't overlook, the simple creative joy of doing all this. But there are two more serious reasons. One is literary and one is theological. We've already touched on them both, but let's just recap. The literary reason is the kappa element in romance. Lewis thought that a good story should have an atmosphere, a flavor, a tone, a pervasive, all-pervasive, qualitative reality. And by drawing upon these seven spiritual symbols, he was able to provide each Narnia Chronicle with just that. You don't look at it as you read, you look along it. You experience it from within, a jovial reality, a martial reality, a solar reality, 7 times over. That's just an interesting exercise from the point of creative imagination. And it's an interesting spin on transferred classicism as well. But the most important reason that Lewis would have done this is the theological one, the Christological one. The whole Narnia series is about Christ. Yes, but Christ in 2 modes at once. Aslan, the incarnate Christ, the incarnate embodiment of the discarnate, the cosmic reality, which is spread abroad across the rest of the tale, but so large and so general that we can't notice it. It's like the large words which escape us on maps, Lewis says. So in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Aslan is the Jupiter who has, as it were, created the Narnian cosmos, but he's also the incarnate Jupiter who bleeds for the sinner. He's the kingly one into whose kingship the children grow up as they come to know and love and obey him. From a theological point of view, this is marvelously profound and deeply meaningful. Jesus Christ is not just a figure from history who moved about among us. He's present also in his living word, which is sustaining the entire cosmos even as I speak. And Lewis gives an imaginative rendering of that theological reality, but in books which can be read by 7-year-olds. That's the amazing thing. The genius required to distill all that learning and all that piety into books which can be enjoyed at the simplest level as an adventure tale by a 7-year-old kid, and yet hardly exhaust the closest attention from scholars. These works are works of genius. Now, on that point, I think I should probably stop, and we can have some Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a stimulating lecture. Thank you, Dr. Ward. And if you have a question, and I assume some of you might, this is the microphone that you will come to. And what we're going to do is just come along this side wall, and you'll see little orange dots. Those are COVID dots. And you'll just take your place there and then move up until it's your turn. So if you have questions, please feel free to make your way around in this way. And then when you're finished after your question, don't walk through here. Just turn around and walk back that way. All right? So questions. Quickly, move. There must be dozens. Be first.
Aha, John Southwards, my HBU student, yes.
Yes, I'm afraid you cannot escape me asking you questions even after the class is finished. Thank you for your lecture. So in the Chronicles, we see hints of other deities and planets than the dominant ones. For instance, Prince Caspian has Baucis, the silver chair, is female dominant, is full of wetness, and has a birth-like imagery when they come out of the underworld. All are very Venus-like imagery that we saw in Paralandra. And the Horseman's Boy has the character King Lune, reminding us, of course, of Luna. So when formulating your thesis, what process were you using to sort out these smaller irregularities?
Thank you. Excellent question. Yes. Well, obviously you are looking for not just chemical purity of imagery, but pervasive imagery, dominant imagery. And I say that because of what Lewis himself says, that in a certain conjunction of the planets, each may play the other's part. But there is a sort of an insulating power of context, he says, so that we know that, for instance, when, this is what I referred to earlier, when we encounter, say, a battle in the last battle, we don't necessarily conclude that's Mars. We've got to ask what kind of battle. We've got to ask whether there's any significance attached to the name King Lune. And actually, I think there are some complicated reasons as to why that's not really a lunar name, though it looks like one. But we needn't get into that level of detail. We need to understand what was your first example? Oh, we have Bacchus. What Bacchus is doing in Prince Caspian. I mean, there isn't a planet, Bacchus, but Bacchus is part of the the Festival of Mars, the Bacchanalian revelry that took place in the Festival of Mars in Roman times. And that's another strong reason why we should understand Prince Caspian in a martial way. Now, of course, critics of my thesis will say, oh, you're just cherry picking. But you've got to realize that Lewis understood the planets to be interpenetrating, interanimating. The gods move in and out of one another, he says, and nothing that is said clearly about them can be said truly. And naturally, there's also a little bit of cross-referencing between the books so that you realize you're reading a series, not just 7 discrete books. So, for instance, I mentioned Father Time is shown sleeping in the silver chair. The Saturnine character is there in the silver chair, the lunar book, but he's sleeping. He's not doing anything. This is a way of setting up his later appearance in the last battle when he will awake and do his Saturnine stuff. So those sorts of overlaps and cross-referencings and doublings up, that doesn't trouble me in any way. One critic of my thesis said, and this is a good point, in Prince Caspian you have at the end of the final battle in Prince Caspian, you have an obviously lunar episode when all the characters fall asleep after the battle, but Aslan stays awake and he stares at the moon all night with unblinking eyes. How lunar, it would seem. Yeah, but everything that happens in a story must happen either during the day or during the night. That's fairly obvious. Does that mean that all the episodes can only be solar or lunar? Because the moon rules the night, according to the book of Genesis. The sun rules the day. Yeah, but the other planets get a look in and turn to their own purposes, as it were, the influences of sun and moon. So in Prince Caspian, when Aslan stares at the moon unblinking all night, that's a beautifully clever way of depicting a martial moment. Lewis, I'm sure, is alluding to the psalm. The sun shall not hurt you by day, nor the moon by night. This is the Lord of hosts who neither slumbers nor sleeps. He defends Israel. Aslan is keeping an overnight vigil while all the Narnians fall asleep. And vigilance is an absolutely key term of the martial vocabulary that Lewis uses. You find it in the Ransom trilogy and in his poetry about Mars. It's the hard virtue of Mars. We must think of a sentry on a castle rampart, watching through the night. That's what Aslan is doing when he stares at the moon all night. It's not a lunar episode. It's a martial episode depicted by means of the moon. This is part of the subtlety and the sophistication that Lewis is deploying. Yes, sir?
I was just curious about the silver chair and about if you could give like examples of how it has the lunar spirit and is connected to the moon, and it's not the lunar book just by default, if you pardon me.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. Well, one key way in which the silver chair is the lunar book is revealed in the title, because the moon's metal was silver, for obvious reasons, because the moon looks silvery in the night sky. Other reasons include the wetness that is everywhere in the book. The rain, the snow, the sleet, even the scenes set in England are very wet. Eustace, you remember, sits down on the wet grass and immediately stands up again. Little drops of water falling off the laurel leaves, even in England, before they get to Narnia. The wetness is part and parcel of the imagery, because the moon, of course, is associated with tides. The moon, first of all, has a gravitational pull upon seas and rivers, in fact, but also the moon, as the moon waxes and wanes, looks as if she's sort of lapping back and forth. And the monthly cycle, too, is associated with lunar episodes in that respect. Wetness, silver, lunacy, That's the third. I won't go into all the details, but the lunacy is the key consideration, that the moon is associated with madness. Lunar makes you a lunatic. And so, Prince Rilian, the lost prince, who's bound to the silver chair in the underground kingdom, is found raving like a lunatic. And it's only in the 1 hour of the night when he's sane that he's able to call for help. In Aslan's name, rescue me, he says. So those are some of the reasons, but there are many, many others. It's a beautifully constructed book, The Silver Chair. It's certainly not a default argument, not at all. Yes, ma'am.
So I was going to ask, like John, about Bacchus in Prince Caspian, but in that vein, I was wondering what you do with Father Christmas, and if sort of the inclusion of the seven heavens in the Chronicles of Narnia has anything to do with Lewis's theory on myth, specifically as extra-literary.
Thank you. Say just a little bit more about what you mean by extra-literary.
Like the Garden of Hesperides, it exists as a concept outside, and then we sort of bring it into imperfect stories through allegory and stories as a way to try to communicate it. But it sort of exists as this truth outside of it.
Yes. So your question is?
Yes, so my question is if the seven heavens medieval model as fit to the Chronicles of Narnia, if that has anything to do with his theory on myth.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. You're quoting there from Lewis's book, An Experiment in Criticism, where Lewis has a chapter on myth and how to define myths. And one of the markers, he says, is that they originate in an extra-literary form. They're not tied to one particular telling. They originated orally, and they could be represented just as well through mime or picture as in words. But he never himself, as far as I'm aware, refers to the Narnia Chronicles as myths. They are fairy tales. They overlap somewhat with his definition of myth, but they don't correspond exactly, and he didn't use that term for them. He called them fairy tales, fairy stories, sometimes I think romances. As for the question about Father Christmas, I think this is one of the most satisfying aspects of this theory, that it helps account for Father Christmas. And quite a few of Lewis's friends, Roger Lancelyn Green being the principal one of them, said to him, even before the book came out, you don't want to include Father Christmas. You really don't. He doesn't belong there. And from one point of view, they're right, because the Narnian sub-created world shows no knowledge of Christ as Christ. So what do they understand by Father Christmas? What would that mean in a Narnian context? It doesn't seem to make sense. And that's a fair objection. But Lewis, I think, wasn't concerned with that kind of logic. He was concerned with symbolic logic of what Father Christmas represents at the sort of emotional or tonal level. So Father Christmas, loud-voiced, red-faced, and jolly, is the archetypal 20th century instantiation of the jovial spirit. And I say that because of what Lewis himself is reported as saying in his own lectures. When he would lecture on the medieval heavens, he would say, those born under Jupiter are apt to be loud-voiced, red-faced, and jolly. And then he would pause and add, it is obvious under which planet I was born. Because he himself was loud-voiced, red-faced, and jolly. You know, he had this great florid face and a booming laugh and a hearty taste for beer and pipes, and he was generous, he was magnanimous. He participated in that aspect of the jovial spirit himself, and looking around himself, as it were, for a jovial, a modern jovial embodiment that he could put in the story. Father Christmas naturally presented himself, and that's why Lewis included him. Even though in strict logic, non-symbolic logic, he doesn't belong. But Lewis isn't concerned with that kind of logic. I think this really helps explain the otherwise puzzling appearance of Father Christmas. He's just that splash of red on the story that you need in connection with Jupiter. Jupiter's great red eye, as it were, is sort of summed up in Father Christmas's bright red robe, bright as holly berries. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yes, so I was wondering, so for last year was one of the years that our the C.S. Lewis seminar class was offered, and for my paper in that class I wrote basically investigating the concept of what you talked about in his essay on stories, and then also I kind of wound up tying that to also his experiences with Surprised by Joy. He talks about how there's specific sort of aesthetic or symbolic experiences that kind of, evoke autumn or northernness. And then even in The Problem of Pain, he talks about how there's this, everybody has a certain thing that they're kind of trying to get at. And then I tied that back to On Stories when he's talking about the thing that he's trying to reach along the length of the story that the story is moving towards. So I'm just wondering, he seems to evoke that kind of thing a lot, and he calls it something different in every single book. In Surprised by Joy, he calls it joy, and on Stories, he calls it story in itself, and you call it Donegality in your book. And so I'm just kind of trying to understand what exactly that is and how you accomplish it, and what combination of theme, and because it seems to have an aesthetic element but also a thematic element, and how much is that intrinsically tied to tying it back to myth? I guess I'm just trying to understand what it is. Maybe that's a really huge question.
It is. It's a huge question, full of, theological and psychological and aesthetic dimensions. Yeah. And you're right that it's all over Lewis's work. This is a fantastic question. Thank you. I don't quite know how to give a discrete answer, an answer that isn't another lecture, because it's all over his work, as you say.
Yeah.
And thank you for bringing in the term Donegality. That's the term it's a term that Lewis coins when he's talking about how books have their own special flavor or tone, and he says it's very difficult to put this into words. It's like the spirit of a place, the genius loci. You go to London, he says, for its Londonness. The spirit of London, we know, is different from the spirit of Washington. But how and why and where, it's difficult to put your finger on any one particular thing, because it's not in any one particular thing, it's in the totality of the things which make London London. And likewise, he says, not just the Londonness of London, but the Donegality of Donegal. And Donegal was a place in Ireland where Lewis liked to go on holiday. And so I take that term, Donegality, representing the sort of epiphenomenal flavor of Donegal, and apply it to what he's doing in Narnia. Because I think what he's doing in Narnia is I think, unprecedented from a literary point of view. I mean, plenty of authors and playwrights have given us Christ characters who do Christ-like things, but no one, as far as I'm aware, and plenty of writers give us books full of atmospheres, Jane Austen, principal among them for tonight's purposes, but nobody, as far as I'm aware, ever marries the two and makes the atmosphere and the Christ character speak the same truth, as it were, represent the same thing. Lewis does that in Narnia, and that, I think, is new in the whole history of English literature. So by Donegality, I mean a pervasive spirit which is summed up in a representative character. The Logos, which has brought everything into being, summed up in Jesus. That's the Donegalitarian approach, which I think is new. There's so much more that could be said, but you've put your finger in, you're trying to bring a language to something which is almost inexpressible, and that's the whole point, that this epiphenomenon, the thing which grows out of the phenomena, is inexpressible. It's the spirit. It's not the letter. And only a great artist is able to conjure the right spirit out of the right materials. It's where a thing is greater than the sum of its parts. Thank you very much. Let's have the next question.
Hi, so after the lunar question, I was kind of thinking, I know you just explained it wasn't a lunar episode, but even if it was, it would make sense because the next book is The Silver Chair. I mean, not in chronological order, but it's really in sun. But my real question is, in The Horse and His Boy, Shasta and his friends are riding as fast as they can for the north with a message. Would you also consider that some of the Mercury symbolism?
Absolutely, yes. Running, racing, speeding, swiftness. If you look through The Horse and His Boy, you find synonyms for running and speed all over the place. Yeah. And I must say that of all the kind of discoveries that are included in this theory, the one that pleased me most was to do with The Horse and His Boy. Because when I was a boy myself, I read The Horse and His Boy, and I was puzzled by that character that they encounter in the Kalaman city of Tashbaan. They meet some Narnian lords, remember? And one of these Narnian lords, we're told, he's not named, but we're told that he's wearing a hat with little wings on either side of it. And ever since I first read that as a kid, I thought, we're not told his name. He doesn't do anything, but we're told about his headgear. Why? Of course, it's a little nod and a wink to Mercury's winged cap. He's not just winged heels, he has a winged cap. It's the petasus that Mercury wears, and Lewis refers to this in his academic writings. Of course, he knew all about the petasus, and he just drops it in there as a, with a nod and a wink. And the Mercury explanation of The Horse and His Boy accounts for that, otherwise puzzling little detail. But yes, run, always run. That's what Aslan says to Shasta. Shasta too must learn to be mercurial. It's not just Aslan who is swift of foot. Shasta must be swift of foot too. This again is part of the genius of the books. It's not just Christological stuff that Lewis is communicating, it's discipleship stuff too, that the children themselves must participate in this spiritual reality out of which each chronicle is constructed. Let's have the next question.
Hello. So throughout your entire argument, and especially when you talked about the initial realization of this new idea for C.S., like filing C.S. Lewis's book and the connections, I was just overwhelmed by how interdisciplinary this idea was. And as you were talking, you talked about astronomy, history, Spanish, theology, philosophy, art, astrology, literature, logic, and psychology. And that required a huge amount of knowledge to be able to combine all of that into one argument. In PSR, political science research methods, we're learning that the best research often comes out after years of just like filing away information informally. And I think I really saw that with the argument that you made today. And so my question is, what knowledge did you have before you came to that realization? And as students, how can we develop the knowledge necessary to make such interdisciplinary conclusions?
Great question. Excellent. And one further discipline that you didn't mention, but which is quite relevant, is music. The Planet Suite by Gustav Holst is a piece of music that Lewis loved, and which I have loved for many years. And I think that in the final chapter of my book, I talk about how a friend of mine lent me a piece of music, not the Planet Suite by Holst, as it happens, but the soundtrack to the stage version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that the Royal Shakespeare Company put on about 20 years ago. And I listened to this soundtrack repeatedly in the days leading up to this brainwave. And I think that's quite telling in itself, that this non-verbal mode of communication, the musical encapsulation of the spirit of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was sort of, as it were, retuning my mind, putting my mind on a different frequency so that I could hear something coming through The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was never uttered, because it was in every part of the story. It was the epiphenomenon, it was the Donegality. And I was finally able to, oh yeah, right. my radio, as it were, tuned into that frequency, finally. And so the musical aspect of this interdisciplinarity is particularly important to me. But how does one get to that? Well, partly just through time and experience. I'd been reading Narnia, as I say, for nearly 30 years before I stumbled across this, and I'd also been studying C.S. Lewis in detail for about 15 years. So I'd been immersing myself in Lewis. Another thing, so that's one aspect. You just got to, buckle down and work hard, and eventually, hopefully, you'll make something out of it. But another point I think that's really relevant is love. A friend of mine who's a teacher at Wheaton College in Illinois, he buys my thesis. He believes Planet Narnia is a good accounting of what's going on in Narnia, and he's presented it to his students. And one of his students said to him one day, well, how do you make this sort of discovery? And my friend answered and said, through love. Love is the great opener of eyes. And I think that's right. I love these books. I love the work of C.S. Lewis. That doesn't mean I'm uncritical. It doesn't mean that I'm slavishly devoted to everything that C.S. Lewis did or said. Love is the great opener of eyes. Love actually enables you to see people's faults more clearly, and to forgive them, and to love them in spite of their faults. And so, having lovingly immersed myself in all this stuff for so many decades, I was well positioned to have this insight. But I would also add, and this is absolutely crucially important, it's not through sheer hard work or cleverness or even love that this discovery was made. It was a gift from God. It was a godsend. It was put in my lap. I firmly believe that, and I've got something about this in the final chapter of my book. It was a gift. It was given to me, as it were, to share with everybody else. And so that's why writing up Planet Narnia and drawing upon all these different disciplines was such fun. I don't think anybody has ever in the history of the world enjoyed writing up a PhD as much as I enjoyed writing up Planet Narnia. Because I knew people were going to be interested, and it was a lovely thing to be able to share with people. And it's been such a rewarding experience because it captures the imagination. And people have written to me from around the world saying, I love what Lewis is doing in Narnia books, and I've just become a father for the first time, and I've called my daughter Jovi, joviality. I've just become engaged to my girlfriend, and I've written her an engagement poem, drawing on the seven heavens. People have painted artworks, they've written music based on the seven heavens. It inspires people, it fires all sorts of creative responses in multiple disciplines. So it brings disciplines together, and then it blossoms forth in different disciplines as well. It's an absolutely beautiful thing. Thank you very much. Let's have the next question. And this might need to be the last question, but we'll see.
My question is, what's your favorite Narnia book and why?
What is my favorite Narnia book? My favorite Narnia book is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And I like that because it's a sea story, and I like ships and water. Messing about in boats is one of the best things, as we know from The Wind in the Willows. I also think that the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is very beautifully structured. It starts out in a very sort of this worldly setting with pirates and political machinations, and it's a little bit like what you might find in a story by Robert Louis Stevenson. And Aslan, interestingly, isn't present in those first chapters. But then in the middle of the book, it shifts up a gear into the truly fabulous and fairy tale-like story with golden hordes and dragons and sea serpents and those sorts of adventures. And Aslan begins to come in to the story. And then in the final section of the book, it shifts up another gear into not just fable, but mythical dimensions. And characters hold out their arms to the rising sun, and birds come flying from the heart of the sun and peck clean this Eucharistic banquet, and everything is getting redolent of heaven, and it's superb the way Lewis ascends up this ladder. And you don't feel that you've stumbled into a different kind of story at the end, but you are miles away from where it began, sort of literally and figuratively. And the way Lewis manages that ascent is absolutely masterly, I think. And then suddenly you're wrenched out of it back into Cambridge. And Eustace's mother, Alberta, saying, it must have been the influence of those Pevensey children that made Eustace so different. And that's a lovely little joke on Lewis's part. It must have been the influence of those Pevensey children. Lewis writes elsewhere how the word influence now just means, an effect. But to the medieval writers, it would immediately have connoted the influence of the planets. I'm quoting now from the discarded image, where he says, if you went to your doctor in the Middle Ages with an undiagnosable complaint, your doctor would have said, well, I don't really know what's wrong with you. It must just be the influence that's in the air right now, the planetary influence. And if he was an Italian doctor, he would say, it is the influenza. And so when we now, these days, still suffer from influenza or flu, we're referring back to this old idea that people became ill because of the influence of the planets. So when Alberta Scrubb, Eustace's mother, says, it must have been the influence of those Pevensey children, she's entirely wrong. It's the influence of Sol, the sun. That is to say, it's the influence of Jesus Christ, figured by means of solar imagery, which has brought about this transformation in her son, in her child. Now, that's just a lovely little involved in-joke by C.S. Lewis. This is part of why I say he must have had just such fun putting these stories together. And on that note, I think we had better stop. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ward, for a stimulating and delightful talk.